My microphone should be muted. Is my microphone muted, Sean?
No, I can still hear you.
Okay, I must have knocked it back on again.
Great. Okay, hello, Eddie. Thanks for inviting me back to come and talk to you a bit more about oceans and such. Last time, the first time we met and the first time we talked, we were talking about the OR Northwest adventure as a rowing from Africa to Americas and sort of some of the things that they're going to see out there in the ocean in general. I'm glad I have a chance to come back and talk to you a bit more, and I want to talk specifically about ocean habitats and wildlife and how the ocean tends to operate and how it's a bit different, and try and get you to understand why and why it might be different and how it might function in these ways. So, quick introduction again. My name is Sean Brilliant. I manage the marine program for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. My background is in marine biology. I've studied snails and beach creatures, as well as large creatures like whales and leatherback turtles in the ocean, and generally enjoy trying to find these creepy crawlies in our world and see what I can find. So let's get into it here. So what is habitat? The first thing I just wanted you to start thinking about. This is a very complicated question, and it's something that ecologists have been dealing with for decades or hundreds of years now. It's sort of intuitive to us. When you see different features around us, we know that it must be different habitats. Sometimes it's different shapes, sometimes it's different plants, it's different conditions in different areas, and no matter how fine it is, you know, we can actually have this intuitive sense that there is a piece of habitat over there and there's a different piece of habitat over here, and they're different or they're the same, and we can make these comparisons. Like in the ocean, this is what we have. Where is the habitat? We briefly mentioned this the other day about how the pelagic system, the surface of the ocean, is a habitat. But where is the habitat here? Is it all one habitat or what? We talked, again, previously, there are several features that chop the ocean up into different habitats. There are several characteristics. One of the most important of which is temperature. So the ocean has different temperatures in different parts of it, and this creates different habitat for ecosystems and for animals. The other thing that's very important are currents, because these currents tend to move temperature as well as nutrients and animals around, so that's another feature that helps divide the ocean up into different habitats. And the other extremely important factor is light, how much light can penetrate the ocean. And this is a very important feature for creating different habitats in the ocean too. So these are three of the very important features of habitat in the ocean. Now, I am cheating a little bit here because there are others that I'm sort of neglecting, which include the depth of the ocean and the pressure, the salinity, the amount of nutrients in the water, and several other things. But these three are extremely important. Keep these in mind, and I think you can understand that even if you can't see differences in temperature or currents or light, you know that these are really going to drive differences. So here's a chunk of the ocean that I wanted to just start with, and we can see different pieces to it. The first piece here is this yellow layer at the top. This is the Photic Zone. This is the amount of the ocean where light can penetrate. This is as deep as light can go into the ocean. It's about 200 meters or so at the most, and much of the production is nearer to the surface. It's a very thin slice. It's only a skin. Beneath this is what's called the aphotic zone. There is no light down here. Where there is no light, there is no photosynthetic production, no productivity for the system. All growth comes from this skin at the surface, and everything else comes floats or sinks down into this lower zone. There is some production that occurs in this lower zone through hydrothermal vents and lithotrophic systems, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But for the most part, it's really important that there is no productivity in this part. We can also chop it up from the land out into the deep sea, because we have sort of the coastal zone that we have here in green. This is the near shore habitat. This is a part of, there's many different types of habitats. It's the area where the ocean meets the land, where the land meets the ocean. There's many different types of habitats. There's also the seabed, the bottom of the ocean, and this creates a different type of habitat too, as well as the whole volume and surface of the ocean itself. So keeping these things in mind, we can sort of look at three broad types of habitats within the ocean. There are coastal habitats, there is the open ocean, and there is the sea bottom. Once again, I'm cheating because there are other habitats in the ocean that I'm sort of omitting. Seamounts are mountains underwater that occur from the seafloor and reach up. Trenches are canyons in the ocean floor. Continental slope is the slope when you go from land or a continent down into the deep ocean. These are all different types of habitats within the ocean as well, but I'm going to focus on these three here. So coastal habitats are the ones we probably know the best. If you've been to the coast or you've seen the coast. Salt marshes are meadows of grass that are adapted to living near the ocean and being inundated by tides. Estuaries are where rivers meet the ocean themselves and they mix fresh water and salt water. Mud flats, rocky shores where a lot of animals can attach to rocks and grow, and mangroves in warmer parts of the world where these are trees specialized to grow in salt water as well. These are well-known coastal habitats that sort of exist mostly on the landward side of the ocean. There is also coastal habitats that occur in the ocean side of the ocean. The coral reefs, of course, are one of the best known, highly productive areas. Kelp forests that we have around here in Canada, as well as seaweed forests in general, are also very common and sort of habitats in themselves in the ocean. And seagrass beds are the other sort of submerged coastal habitat that occurs in the ocean. All of these tend to be highly productive, produce a lot of life, a lot of plant growth. They're all within that photic zone, so they all have light, they all have plants, they have a lot of diversity generally, or a lot of production. So the open ocean habitat, much less obvious features that we can see. Climate and light makes a big difference, as well as temperature. And in fact, sea ice is one of the things that can create structure on the surface of the ocean that animals can interact with. The animals in this habitat are also very specialized, as they are in the coastal zone. This is a blue whale charging through the ocean. Large ocean-going animals, leatherback turtles, designed to swim long distances, hunt for food, large predatory fish that can swim fast and long distances. They tend to be visual, to be able to see what's going on around them and to find their prey. Dolphins are another example, a marine mammal that is also pelagic. But there's also these odd creatures. This is a barnacle taken from the fellas on the row from Africa to America that they ripped off the bottom of their boat. There was several 100 kilos of these things growing on their boat that's just sort of attached. And this is a photo of a jellyfish that they saw. It's called a Physalia or a blue bottle or a Portuguese man-o'-war floating out there in the middle of the ocean. So there's lots of little stuff as well, lots of small animals designed to live in the open ocean. The sea bottom is another important habitat. This is a shot from 2 kilometers underwater on the west coast near the Endeavour site. This is just a large white skate cruising along the bottom. It tends to be quite bare looking. There is no plant growth down here. The light cannot penetrate this deep, so it relies on things falling from the surface and reaching them. And as a result, it looks quite stark and desolate. But in fact, there is life there. And there's life there that we only begin to understand. In some areas, it's incredibly vibrant and diverse, depending on, again, nutrients, temperature, the amount of light penetration, and so on. Hydrothermal vents are parts of the ocean where mineral-rich water deep inside the earth comes out of the bottom of the ocean and feeds into the surface water. And this creates a whole ecosystem that we only discovered in the late 1970s. That sounds like a long time ago to you guys, but it wasn't that long ago. Prior to this, we had no idea that these systems even existed. And these systems are in many ways revolutionizing the way we think about life on this planet, because these are animals that are growing and living without the benefit of sunlight. And they are creatures that we only vaguely understand. Giant tube worms that have no mouths or stomachs but are able to live because of bacteria that live within them, and limpets and crabs. And they're very difficult to get to these areas and study, but we're slowly learning more about them. Here's a shot from NOAA of the sea bottom in a trench at 9.9 kilometers underwater. Flat, barren, stark looking, nothing growing there. It looks like emptiness, but it's not emptiness. These are organisms. This is life living on the bottom. You can't make out these things, these muddy little things very well, but they're called xenophyophores. We don't know very much about them, but they are like giant, they describe them as giant amoebas. I don't know if you know what that is, but that means this is one big cell. We are made up of millions or billions of cells, but this is one cell. This is an organism made of one cell, and it is a large, free-living organism on the bottom of the ocean that we also know very, very little about. It is a fascinating place. Okay, moving from habitats, let's talk about the ocean a little bit and why the ocean is different from everything else. And it is very different from how land and freshwater systems and what they call continental systems operate. It's very different. And let's look at some ways why it's so different. One is the food web and the food chain. Food chains in the ocean tend to be longer and they tend to be more complex. So here's a stylized food chain, terrestrial food chain. We have grass getting energy from the sun and growing. Insects eat that grass. A mouse eats those insects. A bird of prey eats that mouse. So that's a simple food chain. We can see there's a bit of a web because, of course, the mouse might get eaten by a snake before it gets eaten by a bird and so on. Here is a marine food chain. There is phytoplankton, microscopic plants, eaten by microscopic animals, eaten by slightly bigger but small fish, eaten by bigger fish, eaten by even bigger fish, eaten by even bigger fish, or whales at this level. So what's different from this? I don't know if you can notice it, but the food chain in the ocean is slightly longer. On the land we have grass, eaten by insects, eaten by a mouse, eaten by a bird. We've sort of got 4 levels there. Maybe the mouse gets eaten by a snake and the snake gets eaten by a bird, so there's sort of 5 levels, maybe. Okay? In the ocean we have phytoplankton, eaten by zooplankton, eaten by small fish, eaten by pelagic fish, eaten by large predatory fish, eaten by very large predatory fish. We have 6 levels in this food chain. And in fact, on average, the food chain in the ocean tends to have almost 6 levels, whereas on land and such, it tends to have 3 to 4 levels. So there's much more energy moving through the system. In addition, it can be more complicated. As I said, these things aren't very straightforward. So maybe the snake eats the mouse and the bird eats the snake, so it can have more complex interactions. This is even more true in the ocean, where each animal can interact with other animals in many more ways than they tend to on land. And when they measure how many interactions are occurring, they tend to find that the system is actually much more complicated. So there's one way that the ocean is more complicated that isn't exactly necessarily obvious. Another thing is that animals are generally bigger and plants are generally smaller. This is something we don't tend to think about. Here's a sunfish on the top picture here and a blue whale on the bottom. Very large animals. 10 of the largest animals in the world are whales. And then before we even get to elephants, which is essentially the largest animal on land, elephants come way down on the list when we start listing all the largest animals in the world. Most of them are in the ocean. Then we get to basking sharks and whale sharks. We get to elephant seals as well. We get to large predatory sharks, many of them. Plants, on the other hand, in the ocean, they can be big. We have kelp and so on, but they're mostly microscopic. They're mostly phytoplankton. And this is a big contrast between terrestrial systems and the marine system. On land, trees are the largest and almost most dominant form of living organism on land. The equivalent of a tree does not exist in the ocean. A tree, the plant, is gigantic, and insects live on the tree and they consume the tree. In the ocean, although there are some organisms that live on seaweeds and eat them, for the most part, organisms, plant eaters, are surrounded by their plants. So it's a very different system in that way, if you keep that in mind. So why are there are all these differences? Why is the ocean so different from the land? Well, we don't really know, but we know that there are some big contrasts between how the two operate. One is what I just mentioned, which is phytoplankton. These microscopic plants are such a dominant source of plant energy and what's called primary productivity in the ocean. And they are consumed by a class of feeders called filter feeders. Filter feeders sweep the water and collect phytoplankton or zooplankton and consume whatever is in that water. So a mussel or a clam, and this is a picture of an anemone, but also we've got giant filter feeders. We have whales that do this, and even whale sharks that swim through the ocean and just filter enormous amounts of seawater through their mouths and gills and consume it. This doesn't really exist on land at all. I can think of one example of a filter feeder on land, but otherwise it doesn't really exist. The other thing about the ocean that we need to keep in mind is that it is very, very large. It is gigantic. It takes up over 70% of our planet. And just in area alone, if we were to consider the volume, it gets even more complicated. And that's the other thing to keep in mind. The ocean is life in 3 dimensions. On land, there are birds. Some animals are arboreal, so they live in trees like squirrels and such. But for the most part, life is mostly 2-dimensional. In the ocean, life is not 2-dimensional. Life is 3-dimensional. There is habitat above you and below you and around you. There is food and opportunities. There is there is life in 3 dimensions, and that makes a big difference as well, or that is assumed to make a difference in creating some of the differences between the ocean and the terrestrial part of the world, the continental part of the world. So here's what I want you to keep in mind and think about. The ocean has many different types of habitats. It appears to be all one, but in reality there are many, and where it contacts land, it's even more complex and more diverse. But even in the ocean, there are many different types of habitats because of temperature and light and currents and depth and such. The ocean works very different from ecosystems on land. They look the same. We learn about them. I assume all of us learn about them, and we don't tend to think that these things are different. Yeah, okay, you might know about plankton or zooplankton. You might know that small fish eat big fish and so on. But in reality, there is a significant difference. The ecosystem in the ocean operates. It works very differently than the ecosystem does on land or even in the fresh water. And finally, the ocean has very different wildlife. Not like anything we have on land. Very different. And where it comes from and how they operate influences how the ecosystem operates, or vice versa. Maybe these are the animals that arose because the system operates so differently in the ocean. So these are the things I want you to keep in mind and think about, and understand why the ocean and ocean wildlife and habitat are so different from continental and terrestrial systems, and you start to get an appreciation and understanding of why the oceans become so important for us to give attention to and to make sure that we're protecting and conserving. And I think my intention is to talk about that in a bit more detail the next time we have a chance to meet. In the meantime, this is my contact information. Thank you very much for your time, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask them. And if you don't have a question for me, I have a question for you.
Thanks, Sean, for that.
No worries.
Good, you've got that. Okay. Anyone have a question for Mr. Brilliant, pardon me, Dr. Brilliant? As he said, he's got a question for you if you don't have one for him. All right, what's your question, Sean?
Well, I mentioned it earlier. I can only think of one filter feeder that exists on land. Can anyone in this class figure out what that is?
Oh, I think the teacher might know.
Just a second, we may have an answer.
Does anybody know?
Maybe you'll think of one that I can't think of, but I can only think of one example.
You know, the earthworm, is that possible? What about us?
Earthworm?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
The earthworm, Sean, is that it?
Earthworm? Oh, not too bad, not too bad. You know what? I hadn't considered an earthworm. I would consider an earthworm a deposit feeder, which is a different type of animal that does live in the ocean as well. But you're not far off. You're exactly right. They do tend to consume large amounts of soil and dirt and remove material from it. I wasn't considering that. It's slightly different from a filter feeder, which sweeps the medium and collects the food from that medium before they consume it. I think that's an excellent answer, but not the one that I was thinking of.
Anyone else?
Looks like you've got them stumped, Sean.
Oh, can anyone think of an animal that sweeps, that allows the air to pass through, and it captures anything in the air and consumes it? Captures insects from the air and consumes them?
Birds was said. Spiders?
Spiders, yes, a spider web. Spiders that build webs are examples of filter feeders that exist on the terrestrial environment. They are basically filtering the air of insects and consuming the insects that they capture. It's the closest example I can think of of a filter feeder that exists in the terrestrial environment. And there's a couple that exist in freshwater as well. But even in the freshwater system, there aren't so many filter feeders as there are in the marine environment. So, hey, I didn't mean to stop you. It's just a different way to think about it.
In case you were wondering who had that answer, it was the wonderful gentleman in second-year university who thought about it.
Good job. Hey, you're validating that university education. Good job.
All right, any other questions or anything at this point? No, it looks like that's it for today, Sean. Thanks again for a great presentation on habitat, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks for letting me talk to you guys again. See you again soon. Bye now.
Yep, he'll be off in just a second.